Hello, welcome to the conversation on News Central Television. This is a program where we bring you up to speed with all the political happenings on the African continent. I am Gbenga Aborowa. Today on the program, our focus will be on the three-day U.S. African Leaders Summit scheduled to take place from December the 13th to 15th in Washington, D.C. No fewer than 50 African leaders will be attending the summit hosted by United States President Joe Biden. We will look at the agenda and priorities ahead of the meeting. And then we'll switch gears to Kenya, where President William Ruto has broken his silence on his proposal to Parliament to amend the Constitution and create the office of the leader of the official opposition. Looking forward to looking at that and more. But first, we begin in the United States of America, where leaders from Africa heading to Washington, D.C. ahead of the U.S.-Africa Summit that will be hosted by President Joe Biden this week. A three-day summit, which begins tomorrow, Tuesday, and ends on Thursday, aims to further demonstrate the commitment of the Joe Biden-led administration to improve cooperation with African leaders. All heads of states and African Union Commission Chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat has been invited to the summit, except those of Mali, Guinea, Sudan, and Burkina Faso, which are suspended by the African Union. Eritrea was also excluded. In the lead up to the summit, Biden administration officials previewed one major summit announcement, saying that Biden would use the gathering to declare its support for adding the African Union as a permanent member of the group of 20 industrialized nations in the world. Now, joining me to discuss all of this live from Texas in the United States of America is Ejike Okpa, a global affairs analyst. One, welcome to you, Ejike, and thanks for joining us on the conversation.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Ejike, my first question is this. I'll start with the most difficult question. What are your expectations from this summit hosted by President Joe Biden?
Well, I have no expectations. This is not the first time. Obama did this in 2014, and I think after that, Russia jumped in and Moscow jumped in. What is surprising to me is that 54 African presidents will vacate the continent to come to DC to sort of get a lecture on what it is they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it. No other group of leaders, in the world ever gets invited. And then once Africa gets it, everybody jumps in and goes. At the end of the day, you ask your question, what is it that they are going to get, in a 272-hour meeting that there's nobody, no president is even going to have a one-on-one with Biden. So these things keep going. That's why, if you have read some of the things I've said, I call them the people president. It's like, the principal calling everybody to the office. Come here, you just gonna have to come and listen to what's going on. I just hope, that some of these African presidents will say, no, I'm not gonna attend to this stuff. It doesn't have any value in exchange. It's just more like, come here, get lectured, get told what to do. I mean, it's an independent African nation. But oftentimes they are so dependent that they even have forgotten what matters to develop their own nations, on a regional basis. If a Mexican president invites them, now all of them are going to do.
I'd like to follow up on that point, Ejike. There must be something that this country see in Africa. Africa seems to be the beautiful bride. There's a Japan-Africa summit, there's a China-Africa summit, there's a Turkey-Africa summit, there's a Russia-Africa summit, and they are all there in attendance. Hardly do the reverse happens. They don't come to Addis Ababa for an African Union summit. They summon these African leaders and they go to this world capital. So 60 years post-independence for most of Africa's countries, why do you think they are still, that the West and other countries are still pulling us by the shoestrings?
But I like the word you use, summoned. It's a summon. They are summoned and they go. And then, again, thank you for the reminder of the number of years most African countries have been independent. You remember the saying, a fool at 40 is a fool forever. So a lot of these African nations are clocking in 60-something years, 50-something years. It's still the same thing. Thank you for reminding me of these other people that invited me. Why are you going? Africa is the continent that everybody lays claim on except for the Africans. So whenever they are invited, they are going to be told, excuse my description of this, it's just more like your houseboy in the boys' quarters. The Oga calls you in and you jump in there and he tells you what to do. At what point do we say, or the Africans say, we're not going to be doing this? Remember in September, they were at the UN General Assembly. So what are they going to be told now? Even though they are two, UN and US, they are two different, but it was in the US. Why didn't we just have that one day set aside and have this conversation? Now, how much money is it costing each of these marginal African countries to go with their entourage to Washington, D.C. for a 72-hour turnaround visit? What are they getting out of it? Is any of the African currencies are going to be stabilized or given a favorable exchange rate to the U.S. so that the local purchasing power is going to improve? Is it a manufacturing opportunity that is going to? Is it a public safety issue? You look at Nigeria, that for the past, coming on 8 years, that Buhari has been the president, the former retired general. Public safety is a challenge. Buhari has visited more countries than he has even visited states in Nigeria. So what is he going to come back with? I mean, when he came to see Trump, said he was a lifeless person. Now he's going to see Biden. What is he going to get out of it? So the thing is, the African people, they have to start asking their president, what are you getting out of this visit? What has it done?
Talking about gains from this visit, Ejike, one of the major announcements of this summit is that President Joe Biden will back a permanent spot for the African Union in the group of 20 major economies. We know that South Africa is a member of the G20 countries, and it's seeking to elevate the continent's role. How big of a deal is this?
It's not a deal. When you say the African Union, what is African Union? It's a group of 54 African nations. So which country are you now going to make African Union the 55th country in Africa? No. Again, these are some of the things they sell to Africans. And then, out of, euphorism and excitement, Africans don't really pull back and say, what does that really mean? We want strong African countries. We want a strong African country in the East African region, in West African region, in Central African region. So those ones can become regional influences into their neighboring countries. 75% of more or so foreign debt in Africa are held outside of Africa. So how come South Africa is not lending money to Zimbabwe or Zambia or Nigeria lending to others? That's how you create your regional impact, as opposed to constantly going to London, Paris, Beijing, Moscow, or Washington, D.C. to go learn what I can understand if it was 5 or 10 years after independence. But now, is there any university in the world an African hasn't graduated from? What are they coming to listen to these people that they haven't learned? It is just
very poignant points you raised there, Ejike. Now, the question is this. You have the best of both worlds. You've even run for office in the United States of America, and your background in Nigeria. Why does the United States seem to get Africa so wrong? And why are other world powers like Russia, China, and even Turkey making more headway on the continent?
Well, again, good question. But here's what it is. If you look at statistically, no nation in the world has educated the Black race more than America. I mean, you look at Fort Bay College in Sierra Leone. In fact, they built a university. America built a university in Africa before they built one for Black Americans. But the point I'm making is this. It's not that, remember, the Africans love anything that is white. Okay, based on what I know, if I go to the state I was born in Nigeria, Enugu and say stuff, I'm not white enough. They will not even listen to me. That saying in the Bible that no prophet has honor in their village. I think anybody who put that in the Bible specifically looked at the Black race. We are always looking for the prophets to come from outside of our village. And that's why everybody takes Africans and the Black race for granted. Because at the point you got to step and say, I'm not going to listen to this. I'm not going to do this. Look at trade in Africa. Africa is the continent that trades the least amongst itself because it's always trying to ship something outside. Why are you shipping anything outside when your own population, economic development is about the number. So why should the economy of Sweden with 12 million people, for instance, be bigger than the economy of Nigeria with 200 and something million people? I mean, come on. What is in the number? If every Nigerian were to spend $1 a day and everybody in Sweden were to spend $1 a day, why should that economy be bigger than that of Nigeria? Africans are not asking that question. What has happened is the devaluation of the local currencies. You look at the naira. If you had 1 million naira in 1999, you almost had an equivalent of $12,000. 23 years after independence. Where you have had Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala serve as Minister of Economy, you have had so many people from the World Bank, you have had Obasanjo and Buhari, change from
military fatigue, yes.
So what have they done? Anybody who is looking at Nigerian economy on the naira after 23 years now, I think 1 million naira is less than $2,000. So what did they miss in all the business schools and all the degrees in financing that they have? And you go into Washington, D.C., and to do what? The Nigerian has to be able to survive on the naira. But right now,
talking about the visit of this African heads of state visit to Washington, D.C., former United States President George Bush famously referred to Africa as a nation. Former President Trump said some really awful things about Africa, and I'm not going to repeat them here. So why is the U.S. role in Africa sinking, and how much damage control can this summit do to its relationship with Africa?
It's not going to do anything. I mean, Obama called Africa a basket case, even though that wasn't out in the media. When I had dinner with him in Dallas, there were 25 of us in the room, and he said that. Obama said Africa is a basket case. Remember, Obama's father is Kenyan, so he's a Kenyan American, not African American. But the point I'm saying is that, my mom used to say to me, how many times will something happen to you before you're wise enough? The black race, as represented by the Africans, have become the doormat of the world. That's why somebody from Pakistan, India, China, Turkish can come over there and look larger than life, and they succeed. Let me ask you, how many Africans have gone to China and made $1 million contract or won anything major? But a Chinese, an Indian, a Pakistani, a Lebanese can come to Nigeria or any African country in less than a year, and they have become big wigs. Are Africans not observant of that?
So do you think, because there's a school of thought that talks about neocolonialism and that leaders that try to free Africa, leaders like Thomas Sankara, they were assassinated, Patrice Lumumba, and what we see, for example, in the DR Congo is a continuation.
Based on the Africans. It was Africans that enabled it. Africa, it looked like slavery. Slavery wasn't a conquest. It wasn't like there was a war. Okay, maybe there was some kind of skirmishes before, but Africans were the ones who were selling their own. So after slavery, what are they doing with colonial thing? After colonial thing, they became fronts. They became fronts in their own country. If you take $1 million today and go to any Nigerian minister and say, I want this, what do you think they're going to do for you? They're going to fight for you.
So at what point do we begin to push back and say, look, this is not going to be our story? We really need to change things.
The pushback is that you tap into the Africans, the native Africans that are in some of these countries that have learned how to live in those countries to say, guide us. What are we doing differently? I went to college in Nigeria. I wasn't the 17, 18-year-old. I came after youth service. And when I came, I said, I'm going to learn this country. I'm the first native African to have run for the mayor of a major city in America in less than 8 years of becoming a citizen. Yes, I didn't win, but guess what? Yes. I learned that I have been appointed by every government from the local level to the federal level.
And even the audacity to contest. Yes.
Well, I mean, because the only thing I cannot run for in America is that of president, because that's the constitutional that says I can't. But I can run for anything else. But my point is, who is guiding you? Every immigrant group in America came from somewhere. They have figured out how to build the bridge and use their people to access America. It's only the Africans who come here and think, or the white person is going to do them. How can somebody who enslaved you, who was quiet when you were being enslaved, become a solution for your present day? You got to find your own. You have to be unapologetic for wanting to be a successful nation, as opposed to always thinking that because somebody works for the World Bank, IMF, UN, European Union, they're going to rescue you. No. Tell me the school. Put the best white men on the table to debate me about economic development in Africa or Nigeria, and that will make them look like they never went to school. But we don't pay attention to those kind of stuff. We just think, oh, the whiter they are, that's why Africa is being exploited. You know, when we were in school, who do you want to copy from? You want to copy from an A student because you might end up with a B or C. But Africa copies from China. China is still a C country. India shouldn't even be a place Africans are going to for anything, or Pakistan or Lebanon or Iraq or Turkish, because we have had enough Africans, well-educated, confident in their knowledge, to stand up and drive the economy of their respective countries. But we're not, because Africans, again, we are still very timid.
Now, Ejike, back to this Africa-US summit. You don't seem to be very optimistic about the prospects of this summit. The first promise of the Biden administration is, we'll create a seat on that table, the G20 summit for the African Union. And then another pledge comes after his true support on Africa's representation at the G20. He threw his support behind the expansion of the United Nations Security Council, including representation for Africa during a speech to the world body in September. How important is a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council, and which country do you think deserves that seat on Africa, on the continent?
Look, why give African and the whole African Union a seat? Find one African country, if it's Nigeria, South Africa, the ones that has a chance of the potential of being something. Put them in there. Again, you said George Bush talked about Africa as a nation. Again, Africans have this Pan-Africanism, which again was a very wrong, stride or move that Kwame Nkrumah, did. Kwame Nkrumah never secured Ghana. Remember, after a while, Ghana went to, basket. It was all over the place. What happens to these African leaders is that they never really consolidate power in their individual countries and build the confidence and use that as an example to say, hey, look at me, look at what we have done.
I think Gaddafi did that to a certain extent.
I'm sorry?
The late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi did it to a certain extent.
No, Gaddafi was doing that, but when you look at, this is one of the cases I said, when you dive deep. While Gaddafi was promoting, the African United States of Africa, how are you going to collapse all those individual countries to be united? We did the AOU. From AOU, we go to the African Union. And then at the end of the day, a lot of these African countries don't even have regional agreements. They are not trading with each other. They are not, their money, it's not like you look at, for instance, let me give you an example that will shock you. The kwacha is the currency of Zambia. Okay, 1 million kwacha gives you almost 60,000 or 70-something thousand dollars. Okay, 1 million yen. Yen is one of the currencies you borrow when you go to IMF. So 1 million yen is less than $10,000. So why should Africa not borrow from Zambia and make it a stronger country? Instead, you're going to borrow from currencies that are even weaker than some of the ones in your own continent. Again, what book in economics justifies?
Now, Ejike, back to this United Nations Security Council proposal that let's give Africa a seat at the table, permanent representation. Is that really what we should be looking at? Looking at the undemocratic nature of the United Nations Security Council. A permanent member can veto, so adding another African country there would not make it less democratic or any more democratic. Should we be looking at the entire structure of the UN Security Council, overhauling it, or just having a seat at the table?
Thank you for the question. Okay, remember African, it was in 1940-something that, UN, World Bank, all these institutions were created. And then Africa has the largest number per continent of all the member nations, about 54 of them. No other continent has that many numbers. So what I'm saying is that you joined a group that you were not part of the original charter members. So when you join, you should demand a charter review, or you say, I am not going to be part of it. Okay? I'm going to go away. If the African nations say we're not attending any of the general assemblies, again, it will collapse. Or, do it by rotation. You host in America, you host in Europe, you host in Asia, you host in Africa. You rotate it, as opposed to every year, all of you gather in what is it called, in New York. You have your 15 minutes of fame. You say nothing that really nobody cares about. I mean, I live in the US. We don't even care about US. Except when we want to talk about, global affairs or climate change. Every country should strive to be as strong as they can. And the way you do it is to mobilize your local population, let them have the confidence that is needed in the leadership before you start clamoring for outside influences or outside power. Again, when, the first American president, it took more than 100 years for the first American president to leave America to go to another country. Where did he go? He went to Panama. It wasn't until after the World War that America started to, make presence in the world. Why this was going on? What were they doing? They were consolidating power. They
within
were
the sphere of influence.
Yes, they were building the infrastructure to have the influence in the world. But as soon as Kwame Nkrumah, what is his name? Abubakar, Tafawa Balewa, they were all over the place giving speeches. Consolidate your power, strengthen your country, give them the confidence that I am here to serve you and not for you to serve. The problem with the African leaders is that they want to be served. They want to be your excellency, your majesties, and they want everybody else to be less than whatever that excellency is.
Now, some important issue here, and it might be one of those issues that might be contentious when they finally meet tomorrow, this US-Africa summit. If you recall that the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, suggested that African nations choosing to be neutral in the United Nations General Assembly vote on the Russia-Ukraine war meant tacit support for Russia, that one shouldn't stay neutral. What do you make of a comment? And is she suggesting that African countries don't have the agency to decide what positions to take when it comes to matters like this? Because she said if you're standing on the fence, it means you're kind of supporting Russia.
Why is it that any European war is a war that all of us should be concerned about? The first World War was an European war. The second one is an European war. Now we have this one going on in Russia, Ukraine is an European war. How many times have the Western institutions shown strong support about the war going on in Africa? We have, stuff going on in the DRC that's been going on for years. I mean, they have the largest contingent of UN peacekeeping force in what is it called? In Congo. Why don't you have a UN peacekeeping force in Russia or Ukraine, or even the thing going on with the Palestinians and Israelis? Africa is always that last stop where we're going to go give them something, tell them how to do it. So, having an African nation as a member in the U.S. Security Council, is a great gesture. But Africans have to build on their own public safety, stabilize the economy, be able to deal with issues about instability. Sometimes ago, back in the 1990s, there was a group of people that wanted to promote the Republic of Texas. Okay, they wanted to succeed. They wanted to create another. Did you hear anything about that? It was quelched by the Texas troopers. We didn't even have to call in the army. It was dealt with by Texas itself. But if such a thing were to go on in Africa, then what are Africans going to do? They're calling on their colonial masters, or some other people will be selling them illegal, weapons which will go in to destroy the country. Have you ever wondered how come poor nations are able to sustain wars? How come? So the Africans have to start looking themselves in the face. Who are
No,
you killing?
I like that point. Africans need to start looking themselves in the face. And African leaders, a whole bunch of them are currently in the United States. So my final question to you, because we're fast running out of time. What will make this, I know you're already not happy with the fact that all of them ship themselves there to what a lot of people have called a talk shop and a jamboree. So what will make this a successful summit for African leaders so that when they come back home to the various African capitals, they can say, we've got this in hand to show that the summit has depth and effect?
But Mr. Host, let me tell you, okay, there's nothing, I don't know anything that will make it a success for me to say, okay, this is what has happened, because it has happened before. Obama, who was the closest to an African because of his ancestry to Kenya, he didn't do anything, nothing. He said Prosper Africa, the Power Africa initiative. There was no money behind it. He named five other African countries, and African, got excited. But since he did that, it has power stabilized in Africa. Has any currency since 2014, Obama said this thing, improved in their exchange rate parity to the American dollar? None. So again, I'm trying to say, what is going to come out of this 72-hour, jamboree with the people's based on their principle? Maybe I like to be wrong, but I'm just saying.
Okay.
At what point do the people look like you and I, that the whole world looks upon as, oh, this is a child crying, they don't know how to wipe their tears, we're gonna go do it for them. I feel insulted, when I see people that are, white or whatever, try to talk at me. I've been to some of the best schools in the world. I went to Harvard, I'm self-employed, I can debate, I have run for office. But because our own people don't recognize sort of resources that lie in wait,
we definitely need to look inwards as a continent. Thank you very much, Ejike Okpa. I appreciate your forthrightness, candor, and contribution to the conversation today. Always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for having me anytime.
Yeah. Thank you. You're watching The Conversation on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll switch gears and move to Kenya, where President William Ruto is proposing a constitutional amendment. He's just clocked 100 days in office. We'll be looking at the implications of this and more after the break. Do stay with us.